The other thing you're going to want is your flute and either a piece of music or a specific etude book, a specific scale, long tone, some sort of exercise that you're really interested in improving on. There's going to be the workshop's divided into three portions. So we'll first have kind of some reflection going on. I'll talk a little bit, give a little bit of a lecture. And then the second portion will be a mini guided practice session. So you're going to want your flute to kind of try some of these things out. There'll be room for you to ask questions in the chat so I can give you some feedback. And then the final portion will be a little bit more workshopping where you're going to be able to test some more things on your flute and ask questions, and we'll do some back and forth. So take a minute, make sure you're all set up with all your supplies so you don't have to be running around, and make sure that workshop handout is able to be downloaded. If anyone has questions, please let us know. I know Darcy is handling the chat so that I can just kind of be focused on working with y'all, and she'll be forwarding questions to me. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Get started in just a sec. Okay, so let's get going. So hopefully you have everything. If not, keep grabbing stuff, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So my intention for the day is to help you explore, like I said, what it means to become your own best teacher and give you a couple applicable steps specifically on important questions to consider that will help you kind of figure out being a teacher for yourself, and also giving you ways to design exercises or methods for yourself or for your students. So the workshop is, like I said, is divided into three sections. The first is a reflection about how you view yourself in the practice room and how you view your own ability to teach yourself. It's always good just to kind of get a base understanding of where we're at so we can figure out the specific areas you want to work on to grow as your own teacher. The second portion is going to be, like I said, the guided mini practice sessions. So you can kind of see what that process looks like and start to refine it. And the final will be just short opportunity to kind of workshop on designing some specific exercises based on fundamentals or some repertoire that you're working on. So please ask questions along the way. I'll try to answer those as we go. I also am going to have some time at the end for a Q&A, so feel free to save your questions for that portion. Okay, so if you look on your handout, there's a few questions just right at the start that I'd like you to take a couple moments reflecting on. The first is, what skills do I need to be successful on my instrument? And specifically, I want you to think about flute skills. So whether that's around tone production, technique, things like that. You can also talk about listening, write about listening skills that you feel are really important right now for you to be successful on your instrument. So take a moment and just write and reflect on that. And then once you've thought about some skills, you can go to the next question and reflect on what does it mean to me to be my own best teacher? How am I actively teaching myself in and out of the practice room? And in what ways could I become a better teacher for myself? So this is where you're starting to set that intention of, what does this whole concept look like to me? And after you fill yours out, I'm going to share a little bit about kind of how I'm approaching this concept. And if anyone wants to share maybe kind of what it means to be their own best teacher in the chat, you're absolutely invited to do that. Take another 15, 20 seconds to finish up your thoughts on what it means to you to be your own best teacher. So before I tell you what it exactly means to me, I have to share that this workshop was inspired by my first flute teacher, Lisa Burns, who plays in the Utah Symphony. She also teaches at the University of Utah. And when I studied with her in high school, I loved playing the flute. I wasn't a great practicer, but I really enjoyed picking up the instrument and having a good time with it. But I did struggle to grow because I couldn't figure out, wasn't fully taking her suggestions on practicing. But she kept saying this phrase of, you are your own best teacher. And she explained it really well, but it did take me probably 5 to 10 years to figure out what it really meant. And at this point, it's become a really primary part of my teaching philosophy and personal practice. And so for me, being my own best teacher is about asking why and understanding the purpose of what I'm doing in the practice room. Why am I doing it? It's about developing my listening skills, my body awareness, and really developing this confidence in exploring challenges that I'm having, exploring new things on the flute, and then being able to design exercises or ways for me to handle those on my own. So it's how do I take all these skills and tools and my own ideas from all these years that I've been playing and be able to pursue the flute without necessarily the guidance of a teacher in the practice room. I still do seek out information and ideas from other teachers, but in many ways, once, at a certain point, you become your own flute player and you're trying to develop your own artistry and your own voice. And there's a benefit to start trusting yourself. And so that's what this whole process, I think, can be about. And so it's important to understand first, what are the skills that you're trying to learn. One thing that you can do to think about your skills is you can put them in groups of things you have not explored yet, things that need significant work, things that feel mostly reliable, and things that are very consistent. And that might help you if you're trying to figure out, well, what do I work on? Sometimes that's a nice grouping. The next thing that I kind of want to talk about is the science and art and the art of playing the flute. Um, Part of being your own teacher is recognizing that there's an art to playing music and the flute, and there's a science behind playing music and the flute. And so it's being really clear with, well, what am I working on right now? Music is often kind of culturally viewed as a very creative art form, which I definitely agree. It is creative, it is expressive. And I see that part as we're making choices, right? We have all these skills, we have tone colors, articulation styles, vibrato, phrasing ideas. And so the artistic side is a lot of how am I making choices of what to use? And how am I doing that in collaboration with other people, whether it's performers or composers or students? At the same time, playing the flute is also a science. You know, it requires a certain speed of air. It requires a certain quantity of air. Your fingers have to move with a specific precision. And so in that way, you're training specific muscles and you're training your listening skills, your reading skills, um, and a variety of breathing and finger and tonguing skills as well. So if when you can separate the art and the science from it, it can help you get a little bit clearer in the practice room. And I, for those of you who are teachers, I find that this is a really helpful conversation with my students. Is talking about, sometimes you're working on the science of the flute, and other times you're working on the art of playing the flute. So then the next thing I'd like you to write about in your handout is what are your main strengths in the practice room right now? And what are your main challenges in the practice room? So I want you to take about 2 to 3 minutes to reflect on those. All right, and as you're finishing some of your reflections on how you are in the practice room, I want to direct you to the bottom of that first page, which lists a variety of qualities. What's your current knowledge, willingness to explore new ideas and seek guidance, trusting oral and kinesthetic body awareness and others. And I want you to, these are some of the things that I find it takes to really, these are important things to develop when you're becoming your own teacher. And so I want you to get some inventory around how do you feel about some of these concepts? None of these are fixed. These are all things that we can grow and work on, and they kind of change over time as we have different experiences in the practice room, performing, teaching, other people influence us. And so, but I want you to just take a moment and see, like, how do I feel about my own commitment in the practice room? How do I feel about engaging with curiosity? Am I self-compassion? Do I have a lot of self-compassion when I'm in the practice room? Um, how is my aural awareness and my kinesthetic, my body awareness when I'm playing? um, each of you might find, like, for me personally, I find like my body awareness is very strong. I feel very confident in that. Sometimes I feel like I'm very curious in the practice room, and other times I don't feel like I'm very curious in the practice room. It depends on kind of what I'm working on, and so that's something that I'm always trying to work on, is how curious can I be. So anyway, I want you to take a moment and go through those. Take a few notes on, and how you feel about each of the following. Um, if there's something that you're like, oh, I would really like to improve my current knowledge on such and such skill set, maybe take a note of what's an action that you could do to improve that. So this part of the reflection is going to take a little bit longer because I want you to really sink into it. It's going to impact some of our mini practice sessions. So I'm going to give you like 5 to 7 minutes to really sit with these concepts. It's not often, I feel like, that we all get like time to really just sit with them. So here you go, 5 to 7 minutes to just reflect. Feel free to put any comments in the chat at this point. I'm happy to answer those.
No, don't unmute it. No, no.
Why?
I need to be muted for this one.
All right, take another minute and a half, 2 minutes to finish up your reflections. And if you've finished or you're interested in sharing, I'd be really curious to know which of these kind of concepts or skills are kind of hitting you most or resonating with you most right now. You don't have to put how you feel about it, but if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, like, is commitment kind of sticking out to you right now, or honesty with strengths in the practice room, or engaging with curiosity, and just put a couple words of which ones you've been writing the most about. So Beth kindly shared struggling with the resilience in the learning process. Thanks for sharing that and being vulnerable. Practice reflects the time of practice. Yeah. Yeah. It leads the struggle of resilience and how that can impact our self-compassion um, is definitely a real experience. So thanks for sharing that. Struggling with that too as well. And then kinesthetic and oral awareness. Thanks, Elizabeth. Honesty and strengths. So self-critical. Yes. I think many of us can be very self-critical, and it's finding what is that balance between striving for excellence, but allowing for us to be a human being in the practice room too. Continuing to work on kinesthetic body awareness. You and me both, Julie. Much the same. Doesn't change no matter how much I practice. Mm-hmm. Being curious and willing to experiment, body awareness, overcoming tension. Mm-hmm. Body's feeling and push too hard sometimes. Yes. So I'm noticing this is really helpful. There's a lot of trends with people who are sharing around body awareness and also oral awareness. It also seems like getting a consistency with maybe feeling like you're seeing a result. That's something I'm seeing here. And then maybe also like self-compassion, maybe our self-talk when we're in the practice room, especially if things aren't going how we're hoping, or maybe how they went yesterday. This is great. Well, thank you all for sharing. So let's keep going then. Now we're going to move into the mini masterclass portion. And I should just say, when I've done this workshop in person, what I do is I invite like 4 to 8 people, and we do 6-minute masterclasses. So typically a masterclass is anywhere between 15 and 25 minutes for each individual. But seeing how you become your own best teacher is really a short process. It can happen within just a couple of minutes. And so I do a bunch of mini master classes. And I was trying to think, well, what's going to be an effective way for here so that everyone can try it? So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to guide everyone through their own little mini practice session by asking you all very similar types of questions. And then feel free to put things in the chat along the way, or just follow along. And so what we're going to do, make sure you have your flute and your music at this point. Curiosity and awareness is where we're going to start. So I want you've selected hopefully a specific passage. Make sure it's very small. This is not the time to be working on the entire exposition of the Mozart concerto or the first page of the Chaminade concertino or something like that. So select a specific thing and what you're going to just try and listen for. You're not trying to fix anything right now. You're just trying to become aware of what's going on in this passage, or in this fundamental. If you're working on, say, octaves or flexibility, just try and become aware of what are you hearing and maybe what's physically going on as well with your body when you're playing it. Okay. So you're going to take about a minute or two just to try that. So go for it. And please keep muted. That way you can all practice on your own. Um, yeah. Okay, so hopefully you've played it a few times. Maybe you're starting to reflect. What are you hearing? And be honest with yourself. Don't think of it as a right or wrong right now, but rather, what is your observation of it? What are you physically feeling? And then are there things that you're trying to adjust? Um, so take note of that. Feel free to put questions in the chat. If there is something you want to adjust, give that a try, and let's do it again. And maybe you don't have to play a whole minute this time, but maybe 30 seconds of the same passage or something. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple more questions. Obviously, I'm trying to reach a wide variety of potential goals that you're working on, but these are going to be related to, wait, yeah, these are related to body and aural awareness. So if you're trying to work on a technical passage, think about which fingers are maybe being too slow. Which fingers specifically can I speed up? Is it L3? Is it the one on the G key? Perhaps it's the right hand third finger. If you're working on tension, you could ask, like, where am I feeling the tension right now? How is the balance of my flute? Do I potentially need to adjust my head joint to make my balance a little bit easier in my hands? Um, if you are working on a tone element, you could ask, what do I hear in my sound? And what do I feel with my airstream? If I'm trying to go for a more focused sound, do I feel like I'm focusing my air? Do I feel the engagement of maybe my embouchure, or Am I supporting my air really well with my core? Do I feel a fast airstream? Is my airstream really slow? Things like that. So right now, you're just trying to be curious because as teachers, part of what we have to do as a teacher is to be curious about our student. Even when we're providing exercises, it's coming out of a curiosity of, ooh, will this exercise help the student improve in this specific way? Right. And so when you're doing this in your own practice room, you kind of have to play both the role of the teacher and the student. You have to be curious first and say, well, what's going on? What am I hearing? What are all my observations? And then you have to pull from, well, what tools do I have that might help me in this? It may not. We're going to try a round of experimenting right now because that's part of the process. One thing I like to tell my students is that lessons are like a flute lab. It's a flute laboratory. You know, we have things that we hope will work and that might work. And oftentimes it does, but sometimes we'll try something and it doesn't work. And we have to let that be okay. Because really everything that you learn doesn't work is actually just more information. So you're like, oh, okay, well, I've tried this and this is what happens when I do that. So maybe I'll try something else. Okay, so I'll stop talking for a moment, and now I want you to go kind of explore again, and play, maybe trying something slightly different. If you want to put in something specific in the chat, I'm happy to answer a question. You can send it to everyone or just me privately. If you do send it privately, I won't reference your name, but I might reference your question or concept just to help everyone else out. Now, at this point, hopefully you've started to identify maybe kind of what's going on early, and maybe you've explored some things that are going to help. Once you get to that process, that part, um, then you can start designing the specific exercises. And that's going to actually help you improve that skill. So, for example, if you're working on say the Mozart concerto, and you realize you're like, wow, I'm having a hard time changing registers. I'm having a hard time going from the middle register to the high register. For example, in the opening, bum, bum, ba, bum, bum, beat, bum, and that octave is just not really smooth and it's really challenging. So the skill that you're trying to work on is going to be flexibility. And then I recommend finding a simple exercise you can do to work on just that skill. If we start adding a lot of fingers, you're no longer working on just flexibility, you're working on flexibility and technique. And I find sometimes that we want to work on one thing and we end up working on a bunch of things at the same time. And so we're not actually improving the skill that we really wanted to improve on at first. So if you're working on, say, back to our Mozart concerto in D major or G major example, you want flexibility. Perhaps you try slurring octaves just back and forth really slowly, trying to figure out how do I move my lower lip really comfortably? How do I speed up my air really well, or maybe close the aperture? Um, can I do it without blowing a lot of air at the high octave, but rather just using a small amount of air and slowly going between the low and the high register? And then maybe you try that on a bunch of different notes really slowly, but you're working on that skill of flexibility. So then you'll test it in step 3 and you'll see like, oh, well, what did I hear? Was it smoother? Or was that octave actually working a lot nicer? And if so, what did I do that changed? And I tell my students sometimes they'll say, well, I think I did this, or I was thinking about this. And I'll say, that's great to think about it. Did you actually do it? Do you know, could you feel a physical sensation that changed? And this is something that really transformed my personal practice. For many years, I was like, well, I think I'm doing this thing. I'm trying to do this thing, but it was hit or miss. So some days was really good in the practice room. And maybe 2 days later, I was like, oh, today's a terrible day. Why can't I play the flute? It was very inconsistent. It was very frustrating. And then I realized I have to physically feel a change. And once I could do that, then I was able to replicate it every day or in my practicing or figure out how to do it multiple times. And then it became less of a question of, can I do this every day? Is to, well, now I know what to do. I just have to train this muscle to actually move. And then over time, that became habitual, and I didn't have to think about it as much unless it wasn't working. So that was kind of my process, and um, it's not about become like hyper focused necessarily or like too in my head. It's just becoming aware of, oh, I need to move my lower lip when I'm doing larger lip register leaps. That was something that was helpful for me. Um, and I have found with my students that bringing that kind of awareness for them helps them train. It helps you learn to listen to this is the sound that links with the physical action. And so those two questions, what do you hear and what do you physically feel? I'm always asking those two things together so that you can link up those different skills. And then once you find out that maybe this octave practice is really working, um, then that becomes part of your routine because now you're training yourself to be able to move between the registers. And then you can start expanding it and saying, oh, okay, well, I'm able to do slow octaves really well. Can I train myself to do slightly faster octaves? So maybe instead of doing it in half notes, I'm going to do it in quarter notes. And then I'll speed up the tempo on quarter notes. And then can I do octaves in eighth notes? And so on and so forth. And then when you go back to that Mozart concerto and you're trying to do the octaves there, hopefully that's become easier because you've actually done the skill of practicing octaves and you've improved a skill that reaches a much wider variety of your music rather than just I've practiced middle D to high D and now I can just do that one octave only in this one passage. It's, oh, I now understand how to do this type of general playing on the flute. And so becoming your own best teacher is figuring out like what is the root of what's the root of my struggle and how do I improve that root to help me in other facets of my playing. So I recognize that I just said a lot of things. So I want to pause for a moment. And is there anyone that has a question before I move on to the next portion? Or do you want me to repeat anything I said? Cool. Well, let's keep going then. What I want you to do is go back to your music or the thing that you're working on today. And I want you, oh, someone did include. Oh, this is great. Rachel says, sometimes it can be hard to figure out the root. Do you recommend recording yourself to figure that out and looking for consistent problems? That can be helpful. Yeah, there's a couple ways you can do it. Recording yourself is one way. Um, you can also try and find the common link. So if you kind of take an inventory of, so I'm playing through different pieces and different exercises. What are the things that I find are the hardest about a few things, a few pieces? And is there kind of any connection between them? So, um, if you find like maybe leaps are hard at some point, and then you're like, oh, well, I'm have some struggles in this high register technique stuff. And then, oh, there's some articulation things. And it's mostly in the middle and high register. And maybe you start noticing like, oh, the high register is the point. It's kind of the common factor. So maybe I need to figure out how do I play high register tone, maybe figuring out my tone up there first. Um, so yeah, recording yourself, taking observation of a variety of things you're working on. That's a great question. One thing that just came to mind as I was reading, looking for a consistent problem, if you find that everything is just kind of inconsistent, like some days you're just like, wow, I'm like really on fire. And other days you're like, I can't play the flute. Why is there such a big discrepancy? Um, what I have found with that is it tends to be in kind of just the general awareness of like, am I doing a consistent thing? Am I physically aware of what's going on in all aspects of my playing? The other thing you might consider is, am I doing kind of some basic fundamental exercises that are truly like strengthening the skills that I'm trying, the kind of the fundamental skills. So those I'm talking about like long tones. How am I feeling on a single note? Can I just hold this one note and produce the same sound each day or a very similar sound? Octaves are a very kind of fundamental exercise. Um, how do I feel about just even trilling between fingers? Do I have control over specific finger movements? um, Things like that. Articulation, a basic articulation, two, 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 two on a scale, two, 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 two. Um, so if you're feeling really inconsistent, kind of check back in on what are my fundamentals and how am I working on those every day. Okay, so let's go back to your pieces then. And what I want you to work on is finding out what your goal is, what you're trying to improve on, and maybe design a really simple exercise. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Design a simple exercise that's going to help you improve maybe that specific part, as well as something beyond that. And you can use long tones to help you. You can use octaves, slow scales. These fundamental blocks of music can be really helpful with our simple exercises. If you're working on body awareness, like intention, a long tone can be a great place to start. Just, can I hold my flute and play a long tone? And how does my body feel with that? And just kind of taking observation, lift up your flute and put it down and just kind of notice how you're moving. Um, so take a couple minutes to do that. And if your exercise doesn't work right away, remember that that's okay. It's part of the learning process, is figuring out what the exercise is, how is it going to work for you. All right, and I do want to make sure we have time for our Q&A. So I'm just going to go over the end of the handout to give you some kind of future things to work on. So at the bottom of the second page, you have two questions. What 1 to 3 steps do I want to take to become a better teacher for myself? So this is something you can think on later. And then what 1 to 3 skill sets do I want to focus on and or design some exercises for? And so your next practice session, maybe your practice session isn't all just playing, but it's, I'm going to take some intentional time to figure out how do I want to work on this specific thing. And I'm going to take 20 minutes and play a little bit and then take 3 minutes to reflect and then figure out, well, let's do this exercise differently. And then I'll try it again. So it's less trying to go through the motions of it all and be really intentional with how you're practicing. And then finally is on the last page, there's 2 columns. The first is what are different exercises I can do to work on your specific skills, so you can start to write those ideas down. And it's also good to think about, how do I think these exercises are going to help me? It's important to know or to have some kind of educated guess about, well, this is going to help me. For example, a long tone is going to help strengthen my embouchure because it's an exercise that allows me just to hold a note. And by using my embouchure in that way, I'm going to work on strengthening that control or working on my airspeed. And I'm going to be really intentional with it. And I'm not worrying about my fingers moving quickly. I'm just focused on my airspeed. So that's the end of the worksheet. And actually, one last thing I'll say before the Q&A. I was talking with Lisa in the past 6 months, again, my first flute teacher, who kind of sparked this idea of becoming my own best teacher. And she always says, pay attention. So when you're in doubt and you're just thinking, oh my gosh, I'm lost again, we all get lost in our flute practice. And the way to come back to it is, as Lisa says, pay attention, and that will help you back. So be curious, explore things, figure out what your learning process is, change when it needs to change, and stay resilient. And you will become a better self-teacher over time. So thanks so much, everyone. I would love to open it up for questions at this point. If you have any, let me put my email up. If you want to write me, I'll put that in the chat right now. I'll also put my website up, uttyler.edu. So I just put my email and my website up if you have more questions and want to reach out, but I'm opening it up here. Thanks, Susan and Julie. It was fun. I hope this was really helpful for you all. So. I don't know, Darcy, did you receive any questions in the private chat at all?
No, none on my end.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. Oh, thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate your comments. I'm glad it's been informative and glad it was framed really well for you. Some good things to think about.
Can
If
we
you
ask
also,
a question on audio?
oh, please do.
Sure, great, thank you. This is Rachel again.
Hi, Rachel.
Hey, thanks. This was I love the way you framed this. It was wonderful. And shout out to Jennifer online also, who was the one that introduced me to this. But I guess let's see oh Lord, I think I've just lost my question. Oh goodness, that's how my brain is working these days. Oh yeah, so if you've got limited time, or a student has limited time, but I'll just use myself for example. You know, sometimes it can be difficult because you're trying to manage. You know, I've got this music I really need to dig into, but there is something maybe perhaps holding you back a little bit. You know, maybe just to riff a little bit on, you know, balancing digging into the music, but also working on these elements that you've helped us think about how we experiment to get better when we don't have perhaps as much time as we'd like to have.
That's a great question. What I would
I
say,
guess I'm sort of coming from the perspective, I'm sorry to cut you off, but kind of coming from the perspective of maybe is it even better to focus on the experiments and the skills than the actual music?
in general, yeah. I mean, there are times when you just have to learn something and you have to learn it quick and you have to make it work in a concert or performance setting. So I teach in Texas for those of you who are just joining in. We have TMEA, which is really intense etudes. And students have to learn 3 etudes. And a lot of these etudes are above the skill level of many high schoolers. And some of them, like, it's very appropriate, but you have a wide range of students. And so what I've been telling a lot of my students is, you know, you still have to learn the skills of playing the instrument. And that's going to help you more in learning the etudes than just trying to cram through the etudes. So, for example, one of the etudes right now is a lot about pattern reading. So there's a lot of chromaticism in it. There's some arpeggios, there's accidentals just throughout. It's in B flat minor. And what I told my students is like, this is an exercise in learning how to read patterns. So you want to practice note groupings and you want to practice chromatic scales. And so I've turned the etude in a way for them to practice that skill. Does that make sense? So they're learning the thing they have to learn, but I'm trying to help them learn a helpful skill along the way. And so that would be my recommendation. If you can afford to just focus on the exploration and figuring out, you know, what are the base elements I'm trying to work on, in the long run, that investment is going to help a lot because you'll find what fundamentals routine do you need to do, and you can start working on those and just you're increasing your base playing level. But if you're trying to juggle a variety of things, I would still encourage you or whoever to ask, you know, what am I hearing? You know, if I'm digging into a solo piece, what am I hearing in this part? Why is it hard? And how do I work on it in an efficient way? Because the more you ask these questions, you'll start to realize how to practice these things really efficiently. And that hopefully will give you more time. So I would say it's going to take a little while if you're not used to asking these questions in your own practice session. If your student's not used to asking them, give yourself some grace and maybe say, you know what, today I'm just going to ask 1 question or 2 questions and kind of get used to that. But hopefully, eventually it'll come a turning point where you'll start to ask the questions quicker and your answers will start coming quicker. Your ability to explore things will come faster. So does that give you does that help, Rachel?
It does. Thank you. Yeah, that was great. I like
Cool.
the thought of, in many ways, doing this is actually making you more efficient in your rehearsal time. Yeah.
Yeah. In the process of, so I took a 3-year period to figure out how to practice technique better because I really wanted to understand. I kind of hit a point and I was doing all the things I needed to do for the orchestras I was playing in and the recitals. I was like, I feel like there's got to be a way to do it. And so I kind of granted myself like however long I needed to, and I was going to figure it out. And so it took me about 3 years. And I got a lot quicker in learning technique along the way. But what it did teach me is I now have a process. There are 7 tools I use, like 7 specific exercises. That's it. There's 4 fundamental and 3 of them are supplementary. And the 4 fundamental pretty much learns 90% of my music. And that's how I teach. That's what I do. And without fail. And then, so along that process, that was kind of messy and gross along the way, and it was really uncomfortable. I ended up finding a method that now I can go to every single time. And so it makes it like if I'm in a crunch, I don't have to ask myself as many questions along the way. It's become a lot quicker. And so now I'm trying to do that for other fundamentals as well, like trying to become clearer about what's the exercise that I need to do that's going to help me on this. So hang in there. It will turn around eventually. And also like pull on the tools that you have. If you're like, I don't have the time to design a brand new exercise for myself, but I have the time to ask the question, and then use an exercise you already know to work on the specific skill. I want to point to a question from the comments. Elizabeth asked, what do you mean about learning process, finding out what your learning process is? Yeah, so I think the process is, let me collect my thoughts for like 15 seconds before I answer that so I don't ramble. So the learning process I'm talking about is about how can you be efficient and effective. And it's kind of like what I was saying with Rachel, how I had a bunch of different ways of practicing technique for a long time, and I couldn't quite figure out which to use when. And so it was kind of a slower technical learning process whenever I had a piece. And so I was trying those tools and exploring, when do I use this specific exercise? For example, the first technical tool is saying and fingering, which is actually something I still use. If it's really way too many accidentals for me and it's hard to read for some reason, or if the notation just looks odd and I've tried practicing it and it's not working, sometimes I just have to say and finger it just once or twice because I need my fingers to line up with my brain very slowly, just so I know these are the actual notes I need to play right now. And then it kind of creates a nice foundation. And so that's part of my learning process sometimes for really challenging music. And so I think what I'm hoping for you is figuring out what are the exercises you need to learn the fundamentals that you are trying to improve on, or to learn the music you're trying to improve on. Does that help clarify the learn process, or what questions do you have that might expand on that?
I think that helps. Yeah, so just kind of figuring out what the fundamentals are that you're having difficulty with, and then creating something around that to help yourself that will work for you.
Right. right? And that you can see, like, so you'll practice it for maybe a couple weeks or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. And then you'll say, okay, I've done this, like I've really tried this. Is it working for me? And do I need to change it a little bit, or am I happy with the exercise?
Okay.
So you might start with an exercise and say, like, maybe it helps you a bit. And so you keep doing it for a while. And then you hit a point where you're like, this is no longer helping me quite as much as I need it to. So you have to tweak the exercise just a tiny bit.
Mm-hmm.
So. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts?
Could you please consider sharing your exercises with us? You said you do 7.
Oh, the 7
7.
technical tools? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a whole workshop. Let me email
Maybe
you.
you could. Okay.
I will email you about those. Part of them is like, some of them are self-explanatory, and some of them I kind of need to walk you through because they're common terms that people use, but people understand them a little differently. So I'd have to kind of share exactly how I do them. But I'll
Okay.
send you an email.
That would be great.
Actually, I did an online event series last year with Dr. Stefania Newman, and she and I did our event was called Revisiting Foundations of Tone and Technique. And I think NFA archives these on YouTube.
Not all of them.
Not all of them. Okay. Ours might be there. So maybe look that up, Revisiting Foundations of Tone and Technique. The first portion is her portion on practicing tone, and the second half was my 7 technical tools.
Okay. I think I actually went to that.
Oh, great. Thanks for going to that.
I loved your part. Yeah.
So yeah, if you want to revisit those, and if you have any questions, you can kind of go through them again and send me an email or something if you have questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. It's on YouTube. Oh, great. Thanks, Jennifer. Oh, Rachel also put it in there. Thank you so much. Yeah, watch that. And any of you can just email me if you have questions about any of the exercises. And if you have questions about the tone exercise, I'm happy to connect you with Dr. Newman. So she is one of my dearest friends. So I know she would be welcome to your questions about tone practice. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts on becoming a better teacher, self-teacher, or how to apply it to your private studio?
Oh, could you put the link up again?
Which link?
To the YouTube of the one you did last year.
Yeah, so here is, let's see if we can pull it up on YouTube. There it is.
Oh, okay. Oh, don't leave it on enough, long enough.
And trying to see where my My portion starts at like the 30-minute mark. What's cool about that workshop is Dr. Newman and I, we actually taught each other for 8 weeks. Our strengths is the other person's room for improvement at the time. And so we thought, well, let's teach each other. We were roommates and doing our doctorates at the same time. And so in that workshop, we also talk about what it was like to go through the process. So she talks a little bit about how it was going through the technical process that I taught her. And I talk a little bit about what it was like practicing tone in the way she had asked me. So what's helpful is also the exercises we give are very simple, which is a lot of what I talked about in this class is how do you creating simple exercises. So it might give you some ideas of what that can look like. Any other questions or thoughts? Or if anyone wants to stay on afterward and ask something privately that they don't feel. Okay, question. Do you try to limit the number of experiments or mini elements you are working on in time or with the student? Good question. Yes. Unless you have a lot of practice time, I do limit the number. I try and keep it between 1 to 3 skills that I'm working on. For students with beginners, with students, 1 to 3 specific skills. Like you might have them practice like a routine that includes a bunch of things because you want them generally growing and improving in all areas. But in terms of like, oh, I want you to really focus on this, giving them just a couple things can be a really wise idea. That way they can spend the time and learn how to ask questions on that. And I find that they'll actually really improve on that. And then you're teaching them, especially if you go through that process. I do this with all my students. I ask them questions all the time. And they're, one of the best compliments from one of my 8th grade students many years ago was, oh my gosh, that was a great lesson, but you make my head hurt. Because I had asked him to really think about what he was doing while he was playing. And he gained a lot of awareness. And he was like, I didn't realize I had to think that much, or that that all of this was actually going on. And that lesson was a little challenging, but he came back next week and he was like, oh my gosh, I know how to do this now. And it's because we had really walked through the question asking process in the lesson. So in a lesson, if it's like a 30-minute, 40-minute lesson, I'll typically pick one thing that I'm going to walk them through a more kind of an in-depth process of question asking. And then everything else is, play something. Okay, let's I'll give you some feedback on it, ask you what your thoughts were really quickly, and do that. But yes, limit the number of experiments. And I would say commit to doing that experiment every day that you practice. That way you can feel some consistency with it. Other questions? Cynthia, I know you just turned your sound on. Do you have a question?
No,
Oh, okay.
I just wanted the YouTube thing. I did do the revisiting tone and technique with you last year, and I thought it was excellent. So I want to make sure I can watch it again on YouTube.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming last year and to this one as well. I'm glad that these have been helpful for you. Any other questions? Like slowly. Hi, Kim. I'm really looking forward to our lesson soon. I don't know if she can hear me. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm looking forward to meeting you.
I know, finally in person after all this time.
I know it.
So now you got an even bigger taste of kind of the teaching philosophy and at work.
Awesome.